Dear Father in heaven, thank you, Lord, for our blessings. Thank you for a wonderful Sabbath day, for the messages that were presented and the fellowship that we had together. I pray, Lord, that you will be with each head bowed, and as we study these histories, Lord, and what you wish to teach us, I pray that you'll bring clarity and purpose, that we might have a clearer understanding of what is happening in the world around us and what to expect in the future. I pray, Lord, for words from on high, that you will direct these classes. I pray in Jesus' name. Amen. So it's been a few days since we met, lastly on Thursday morning, so I'll just do a little bit of revision. We had, over the course of last week, we started off with Fatima, looking at Fatima on a reform line, and then we kind of left off that study, understanding it has implications further along. And we went into Acts 27, picked up the number 273 and took that down to 273 BC. And this alliance that was created out of the Pyrrhic War, out of a war between the King of the North and the King of the South. We saw that the King of the South is represented by King Pyrrhus of Epirus. And in mapping the kings of Epirus and overlaying them on the King of the South in our history, we could see this quite strong pattern that Pyrrhus represents Putin, and Putin also is typified by Stalin. So Putin typified by Pyrrhus and Stalin. And we've rubbed it off the board, but we've gone over it a few times now, that line, how it's divided into two histories. You have Pyrrhus in Macedonia, and then Pyrrhus in Italy, with a clear split in 285 BC. So understanding that Pyrrhus can also end from beginning, that Pyrrhus is Putin and Putin is Stalin, we then went into a history of World War II and saw that there is also in communist Russia and the Soviet Union, you can also see an Alpha history and an Omega history. The papacy tries to take down Russia twice, in our history and also in the Second World War, particularly in 1941. So what we had was Alpha Pyrrhus, Omega Pyrrhus, Alpha Russia, Omega Russia. We cut these lines where they diverged or where they met, and overlaid them by understanding the end from beginning. Putin is typified by Stalin, and they should represent the same history. In cutting that history and overlaying all our lines, we recognised that an Alpha history is a history of failure. And an Omega history is a history of success. I'm saying this from the perspective of the King of the North. Alpha history with Russia is a history of failure. Omega history with Russia is a history of success. And we can map that fairly well if we look at the end of our Alpha for Pyrrhus. It's a partial victory for the King of the North. Omega total, Alpha partial, Omega total. If we look at what lines up with Panium, 287 BC all the way down to Panium, King of the South wins, King of the North wins, King of the South wins, King of the North wins. The Omega histories line up perfectly. The Alpha histories line up perfectly. But when moving from history to history, we can't just drop it down. There is a difference between a history of failure and a history of success. So I'll just rub out this board for space. We understood, here we mapped the 4 generations of German government, understanding that we can place the number 4 in both histories. I want to just remind us of Fatima for a moment and our study on the counterfeit, and clarify one point that probably wasn't made very clearly. When we did the line of Fatima, I'm not suggesting that that is the papal reform line. Our Millerite history stretches from 1798 to 1844. It's not a 2-year history, and Fatima is not the reform line for that counterfeit. I'm not going to go into proof because I know at the end of our time together I want to draw out the true and the counterfeit and prove that and show that much more clearly. But I do want to make one point. In the true, we go from 1798 to an increase of knowledge in 1818, and that history ends, just to keep it on a simple level, 1844, October 22. And that is 46 years. And who is raised up in 1798? Is it Ellen White? No, it's William Miller. It's many years before her work truly begins. So, if we think about the counterfeit, what I want to suggest is that it isn't Lucia that we first look to. Lucia is a counterfeit of Ellen White, not of William Miller. The counterfeit of William Miller is raised up in 1899. And that is Eugenio Pacelli, who is Pope over this history, the history of World War II. He's raised up in 1899. What we placed on a reform line was Fatima. 1899, I'm going to mark 1917. And what we placed on a reform line was zooming right into their increase of knowledge. In the increase of knowledge, we do see everything, the whole picture, all the information in a nutshell. We teach that for our reform line, for our movement. In our increase of knowledge, everything was there. 1818, everything was there. And when we did the line of Fatima, everything was there and on a reform line. But if we're going to track the counterfeit, I would suggest 1899 to 1945. And this is 46 years. Pacelli is raised up, ordained a priest. In 1899, he goes to work introducing Code of Canon Law. First, it's the church, and then the world. His first work is reforming the Catholic Church. His brother negotiates and writes the Lateran Treaty. He negotiates and writes Code of Canon Law, bringing the Catholic Church under one central power, authority of the Pope himself, which had not existed till that time. This work begins in 1899. You have a 46-year history marked. And Fatima, I would suggest, is an increase of knowledge. The reason I'm wanting to do this now is really twofold. One thing that I want to show is when we go over to the history of World War II, it's an interesting history, but it's also, as I've kind of previously stated, it is the alpha history, it's the counterfeit version of Millerite history, both for the papacy and for the King of the North, King of the South. The reason I kind of wanted to go into that is I have faced questions about whether or not we even can overlay this early history with an alpha history and an omega history, if they can be overlaid. And I would suggest that if we do that for the counterfeit, if we can't do that for the counterfeit, then we can't do that for Millerite history. So if we're going to be fair and overlay Millerite history with our reform line, we need to be able to do that for the counterfeit as well. And one other point with that it's just worth thinking about if you're open to consider it. What is 1945 for the papacy? We understand that this is Panium. But for the papacy, what is this experience? This is a disappointment. That Iron Curtain extends a swim away from Italy itself. The Bolshevik Revolution is trying to come up in Italy, and they've lost all of that eastern territory. Hitler, the beast, just was defeated partly by the King of the South. And this is a disappointment. Panium in our history, do they have a disappointment? Who wins at Panium? The King of the North. This is what brings about 273 BC, which is the rise of the papacy. Panium in our history is not a disappointment. 1844 was a disappointment. October 22 in our history, is it a disappointment? I would suggest no. At least if we could just consider that. It's been said, I've heard it said from a few different ways from a number of people that are expecting a disappointment, that the Millerites had the date right and the event wrong. And I think because it sounds neat, they're saying that we're going to have the event right, the event right and the date wrong. Kind of switching the two. And I would suggest that can't be. We do not have a mistake in our reform line. We are a history of success. That's all, the only thought I really wanted to draw out there. So that's in the back of your minds, but also so that we can see World War II in that context. We have beginning of ancient Israel, end of ancient Israel, beginning of modern Israel, end of modern Israel. And I would suggest that when we go into World War II and that history, we're also plotting the beginning of modern Babylon, which typifies the end of modern Babylon. That is my argument to overlay these histories. So we're going to move on from looking at the counterfeit now and go back into the conclusions we made with these reform lines at the end of Thursday's study. You have a paper in front of you. It's titled The Kerry Abdullah Secret Deal by William Engdahl. And there's a news site called the Global Research Agency that published this. And I just want us to spend a few moments looking at this article. It's a long article, so we won't read it all, but I'll just map it for you. It spends the first page and a half showing, it's really tracking the oil prices, the oil market. It's written by a fellow who's written books on how oil impacts global affairs. He's interviewed frequently on different news channels. But what really grabbed the attention of some people in this movement was this underlined section on the second page. And it says on September 11, this is September 11, 2014, the US Secretary of State Kerry met Saudi King Abdullah at his palace on the Red Sea. The king invited former head of Saudi intelligence, Prince Bandar, to attend. There, a deal was hammered out which saw Saudi support for the Syrian airstrikes against ISIS on condition Washington backed the Saudis in toppling Assad, a firm ally of Russia and de facto of Iran, and an obstacle to Saudi and UAE plans to control the emerging EU natural gas market and destroy Russia's lucrative EU trade. A report in the Wall Street Journal noted there had been months of work months of behind-the-scenes work by the US and Arab leaders who agreed on the need to cooperate against Islamic State, but not how or when. The process gave the Saudis leverage to extract a fresh US commitment to beef up training for rebels fighting Assad, whose demise the Saudis still see as a top priority. What they're marking, September 11 of 2014, you have this alliance between Obama and Saudi Arabia to take down Assad, and it's based in oil. You have 4 pages of evidence for this with statistics, research, and online, what I didn't put in the document, graphs and maps showing those oil pipelines. This was sent to me by some in the movement, and I found it fascinating to mark a September 11 in 2014. And I kind of left it in the back of my mind for a long time. And then when I started looking at these histories and the mode of warfare, I went back and had another look at this article. And what I want to note is this 4-page article with all of its statistics and graphs is complete fabrication. This September 11, 2014 deal never happened. This is what we're facing, and this is the point I wanted to make. What is the Global Research Agency? I went to the author of this article, to his own page, because he was just contributing information to this news site, but I went to the source, and at the very front of his webpage, the first thing you see is a video right in the center where he's giving his expert oil analysis to Russia Today, where he primarily speaks out of. Then you go through all the other articles he writes. One article against the US nuclear shield. His arguments are that the United States has created all the wars we see in the world today. He listed 7 that the United States purposefully, intentionally created and continues those wars so that they can continue to make money out of building machinery and fighting war, etc. All of these articles are pro-Russian, with such bitter statements as saying that Washington continues to tear up solemn international arms treaties and illegally proceed to install its global missile shield is basis enough for those in Moscow, Beijing or elsewhere to regard US promises, even treaties, as not worth the paper they were written on. The About page for the Global Research Agency says, in an era of media disinformation, our focus has essentially been to centre on the unspoken truth. The Global Research Agency appears Western. It's based out of Montreal, Canada. But their material does not come from Montreal, Canada. Some of their pages: US struggles to keep Asia in dark age, US-funded newspapers and activists. Russia is most likely subsidizing pretty much all of the Global Research Agency papers. And there is one site that is dedicated to trying to uncover the sources of these sites. And what they say about the Global Agency is, what was old is new again. Welcome to Soviet active measures. What I'm wanting to note is how easily it appears and how cautious we need to be when we start getting into the idea of alternative facts. WikiLeaks, the Internet Research Agency, the Global Research Agency, and there are dozens of other news sites. It's becoming a huge problem where we find things online that, if you trace back to original sources, always seems to bump into Russia. And this is what we saw particularly in 2016. The problem is that what's broadcast in these websites is then picked up by Western sources. So what WikiLeaks publishes, what the Internet Research Agency publishes, the Global Research Agency, and even most obviously just Russia Today, finds its way into the Western stream. and it's taken and churned out by cable news, InfoWars and other US websites. In particularly those, it finds itself into other channels, but not nearly as often. 2016, you see videos of Hillary Clinton's health failing, of appearance of seizures. You go back to the original source, the very first time those videos are clipped and published is on Russia Today, almost every single time. If you want to discuss WikiLeaks and Julian Assange found his big break on Russia Today as a guest of Russia Today. That was where he would be invited to come and give his analysis on pretty much on how he viewed his worldview. The servers for WikiLeaks systems are all centered in Russia. Who told Edward Snowden to go to Russia in the first place, to stay in Russia? Julian Assange. He told Snowden, "You'll be safe in Russia." A few weeks ago, the story came, it was earlier this year, it was quite a fair while ago. It came out that he's currently stationed in the embassy in, Ecuadorian embassy in London. And he's a problem for them. They really want him out of that embassy. And how they were trying to do that without having him arrested was to give him some type of diplomatic position. If they gave Julian Assange a diplomatic position, then they could get him out of London and into a foreign country, and he would no longer be their problem. It only came out a week ago exactly where they wanted to give him this diplomatic post. And where were they going to send him? Russia. Why is a man that does what Julian Assange does, why is he safe in Russia? Is it because they have no corruption? We need to be extremely cautious of the sources that we listen to. And the reason I wanted to put that in place now is because we're about to look at the new mode of warfare. I want to first take it up in the Bible in Revelation chapter 12. If you would open your Bibles to Revelation 12, verse 7. Revelation 12:7. The first account of war in the history of the universe says, "And there was war in heaven. Michael and his angels fought against the dragon, and the dragon fought and his angels, and prevailed not, neither was their place found any more in heaven. And the great dragon was cast out, that old serpent called the devil and Satan, which deceiveth the whole world. He was cast out into the earth, and the angels were cast out with him." The first war the universe had ever seen. What was that mode of warfare?
Words.
Sorry?
Words.
Was this a hot war? This can't be a hot war. Satan didn't stand a chance. The alpha of warfare is an information war, a propaganda war, a psychological war. And from beginning, I would suggest that war ends for us. The last war is an information, propaganda, psychological war. 7MR 62.3. I'll read, paragraph 2 and 3, 63.2. if you have your devices. And it is at the beginning of your notes page, these two paragraphs at the top. The influence of mind on mind, so strong a power for good when sanctified, is equally strong for evil in the hands of those opposed to God. This power Satan used in his work of instilling evil into the minds of the angels, and he made it appear that he was seeking the good of the universe. As the anointed cherub, Lucifer had been highly exalted. He was greatly loved by the heavenly beings, and his influence over them was strong. Many of them listened to his suggestions and believed his words. And then she quotes War in Heaven. Cast out of heaven, Satan set up his kingdom in this world, and ever since he has been untiringly striving to seduce human beings from their allegiance to God. He uses the same power that he used in heaven, the influence of mind on mind. All I'm wanting to note there is, if we mark end from beginning, this isn't a hot war, but an information war. When we did our lines of the World War II, the lines of Pyrrhus and the lines of Russia, and we dropped these waymarks, marking the differences between failure and success, what we saw was, beginning in 1989, you have a proxy war. You can also mark the period of 10. Then you have Tarentum attacking Thuri, you have the crisis in Ukraine and the invasion of Russia when it takes Crimea. You also have the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact collusion. The North and the South go into an alliance. And they go into an alliance for the following battle. For Hitler, that was the invasion of Poland. For us, it is those three powers, the executive, judicial and legislative branch. This marks the beginning of the Western Front. And then you have this straining of that alliance at our loud cry. A smaller battle before the major battle at Raphia, where the war on the Eastern Front begins. And then you have the Battle of Panium, where the King of the South is defeated and then progressively falls till Sunday Law. What we left off from discussing in Thursday morning's class was the mode of warfare. We see it, elephants decide the Battle of Panium, they decide the Battle of Raphia, they decide this battle at the loud cry from Heraclea. They also decided the Battle of Ipsus, which is 2016. So if we're marking mode of warfare, if we want to understand Raphia, we have to understand 2016. What I suggested after that, and I'll suggest it again, is everything for our time that we need to know was capsulated in the increase of knowledge. So if we're going to look at mode of warfare and if we're going to understand Raphia 2016, I want to suggest that we need to go back and trace this development from the time of the end, from 1989. And this is what we will do for the remainder of our class. So 1989 was a big year. A lot happened. It was a milestone year. And this is nothing new. I've heard this spoken of by some of our leaders on numerous occasions, but I want to remind us of one major invention, what is described as one huge milestone. And that is the invention of the World Wide Web. It is described as one huge milestone in what we say we're currently in, which is the information age. I'm going to quote from, I left a little line here to mark when we're jumping from inspiration to Time magazine. I wanted to make that distinction. On page 1, the bottom half, this is taken from a book that Time magazine put out in 2009 to mark the 20-year anniversary of 1989. And what they're wanting to draw attention to is what a milestone year that was. So they in that book, they review the history of 1989 with pages on each different incident that made up that year. And this, what we're reading from, is their page dealing with the invention of the World Wide Web. It says, when Tim began his work, this is Tim Berners-Lee, began his work with Robert Callao in 1989 at CERN, Europe's particle physics lab in Geneva, the internet was just beginning to emerge as a commercially available service. But it lacked standardized systems for formatting, storing, locating, and retrieving information. What I want to note is computers were around from about World War II times into going back a little bit. Into World War II, pretty much like gigantic pocket calculators. But none of these computers were able to connect to each other. They're independent, ginormous machines, just like a giant calculator, but none of these computers connected, so they were not the internet. The first time that these computers kind of joined together, they're able to join them, is in 1969. And that is usually marked as the invention of the internet. So in 1969 they begin joining all these computers into one network. But what this network lacked, what Tim Berners-Lee brought, was a standard system for formatting, storing, locating, and retrieving information. So I want to note this is more than the internet, this is how information works on the internet itself. Beginning in the second paragraph. Like many people, I was completely unaware at the time of these historic developments. The web first came to my attention in early 1993 when Mark Andreessen and Eric Beiner released their graphical browser called Mosaic. It is hard to evoke the stunning impact Mosaic had on the community of internauts who until that time were accustomed to text-based tools and keyboard navigation for retrieving content. The addition of imagery and magazine-like layout transformed the internet into a gigantic publishing vehicle and information creation engine. This is what is happening from 1989 into the early 1990s. We are going through our increase of knowledge. At the same time, they are turning this internet system into a gigantic information creation engine. They go on to say it was as if a new guild based on a new technology had been created in the Middle Ages. Down to the next, the underlying hasn't come through. It says the tsunami, a couple sentences down. The tsunami that flowed into the internet via the World Wide Web also created the need for tools to find specific content in an ocean full of information. What these inventions of Tim Berners-Lee did was create this information engine on the internet where it could be disseminated and accessed in the way we know today. So if you consider the internet as like a worldwide network of computers that are linked, they describe the web as being like an application running on the top of the internet. And it's how it's using that application by which we share web pages and information. he created one language for every computer system. So what he invented was HTML, HTTP, URLs, and the World Wide Web. So 1969, the invention of the internet, this is known as ARPANET, and it was primarily used by American defense systems to link all their computers. First computer-computer connection is in 1969, and it spreads quite rapidly. 1989, Tim Berners-Lee invents the World Wide Web. The paper he writes is titled Information Management. A proposal. He wrote this paper March 12, 1989, Information Management, a proposal. They say this is central to the development of the information age. Those two quotes on your second page at the very top. So in 1989, he invents the World Wide Web. In 1990, he writes the first web browser. In 1991, he releases that browser first to research institutions and then to the general public. So what is invented in 1989, developed in 1990, released in 1991. So you can look at this history in three different ways. You can see it as the fall of the Soviet Union, you can see it as the increase of knowledge for us, and you can also see it as the invention and development of the World Wide Web. The next year I want to mark on our information line is 1996. And what is known as Moonlight Maze. This is an article written in 2016 by the New York Times. And I haven't got this on your paper here because I'm just going to pick out snippets. And what they're talking about is this hack of the DNC in 2016. And they say the United States had 2 decades, 20 years of warning that Russia's intelligence agencies were trying to break into America's most sensitive computer networks. Those 20 years take you back to 1996, and what they're marking is Moonlight Maze, the first Russian hack of American computer systems. October 7 of 1996, it was a computer operator at the Colorado School of Mines that discovered nighttime computer activity that he could not explain. The Colorado School of Mines itself wasn't that of that much importance, but they had a major contract with the Navy. They spent a long time trying to connect the dots and trace where this was coming from and what was going on. This took them 2 years, working day and night, tracing how it hopped from the Navy to the Department of Energy to the Air Force and NASA. In the end, they concluded that the total number of files stolen, if printed and stacked, would be taller than the Washington Monument. Whole weapons designs were flowing out the door. So 1996, you have the first cyber attack. From Russia against the United States. They say it was a first taste of what was to come, an escalating campaign of cyber attacks around the world. Was this cyber attack to take down infrastructure? No, all they wanted was information, weapons designs information. Our next port of call is 9/11, 2001. And I want us to have a look at the Patriot Act, what it was for and what was done under the Patriot Act. This act was passed 45 days after 9/11 in the name of national security. Indented in your notes page, indented because it's a direct quote, and this is what President George Bush said on October 26 as he signed this act into law. He said, "Surveillance of communications is another essential tool to pursue and stop terrorists. The existing law was written in the era of rotary telephones. This new law that I signed today will allow surveillance of all communications used by terrorists, including emails, the internet and cell phones." Senator Feingold, the day before he signed this into law, said, "The administration's proposed bills contained vast new powers for law enforcement, some seemingly drafted in haste, and others that came from the FBI's wish list that Congress had rejected in the past." So just noting, this is things that they had wanted for an extended period of time but had not been able to get through Congress. And after 9/11, it gave them the opportunity to, on the wave of 9/11 and the fear that that generated, to get this wish list through. So October 26, the Patriot Act is signed into law, and noting what George Bush said this Patriot Act was for, this is for the surveillance of communications. This is for the accessing of personal information. And what he's particularly noting is that information that is online, that is on the internet and the World Wide Web. Up to this time, as he points out, any laws showing what they could access was they could access pretty much your record list of who you'd called on a rotary telephone. And what he wanted to do was bring in laws that meant that they could now access your information as it exists on computer systems and the internet. Emails, sites you visit, all these different things. There's an interesting article written by Nancy Chang, a senior litigation attorney at the Centre for Constitutional Rights. And she says that this Patriot Act launched a three-pronged assault on privacy. First, it granted the executive branch unprecedented and largely unchecked surveillance powers, including the enhanced ability to track email and internet usage. Second, the Act permits law enforcement agencies to circumvent the Fourth Amendment's requirement of probable cause. So under the Constitution, they need a reason to access your personal information. That no longer exists. Third, the Act allows for the sharing of that information between criminal and intelligence operations, thereby opening the door to a resurgence of domestic spying under the CIA. I went through the Patriot Act in some detail, and to be honest, it was mind-bogglingly confusing. And I think it was designed to be that way, because it isn't so much about what the Patriot Act said, it was what it was used to do. For example, all of these laws that they brought in were to be used against terrorism, but their definition of a terrorist is an enemy of the state. It's a broad definition. The definition they give is so vague and expansive that it can pretty much include Greenpeace, government protesters, anti-abortion advocates, environmental advocates, anyone that is seen as a danger to the state can be labelled as a domestic terrorist. And what they've used the Patriot Act to do 99.99% of times has not been for terrorism. In fact, in an internal audit around 2014 time, they acknowledged that the Patriot Act had not thwarted or helped thwart a single terrorist attack inside the United States. It had, though, been useful on the war on drugs. So it wasn't used for what they are describing. Under the Patriot Act, some of the things that are able to be done. Section 215 is one of the most controversial. The director of the FBI or someone as low in rank as an assistant special agent in charge can apply for a court order requiring the production of any tangible things meaning anything, books, records, tax files, anything, upon his written statement that these items are being sought for an investigation, quote, to protect against international terrorism or clandestine intelligence activities, which is clandestine intelligence activities being extremely broad. The business, so a business or organisation, your accountant, your librarian, anyone that you are in some type of, anyone who has information on you, even family members can be presented with an NSA letter if those family members are in positions of business. And it's essentially a subpoena requiring that person to hand over every piece of information they have on you, your tax files, anything, without them giving any proof that those things are actually required for an investigation. These letters must remain a secret, so if I received a letter on you, I would have to hand over, without any evidence of why those things are needed, everything I would need it to be handed to the government, and I would be then, if I ever told you that I had done that, I could be charged and jailed, and that has happened. It's illegal to notify the person that you've ever even handed over their private information. What they did to be able to circumvent where it says that a court order in the Constitution, these things can't just be done without an order from a court where they show probable cause, that they have a reason to need your information. What they did was create a secret intelligence court so they could technically get a court order. We're going to look at that court, and it's the FISA court. It was set up in 1979. This is the FISA court. This is a court they go through when they want to access information for an investigation. Began operating in 1979, and from 1979, when it was set up, to 2013, the court approved 35,434 government applications. 35,434 times. The secret court with secret judges said yes, that the government can access information. This is a 34-year history that they're tracking. How many times did it say no to the government? 12 in 34 years. So you have a secret court that on average passes 1,042 requests a year and rejects an application approximately once every 3 years. One of the reasons that this is set up the way it is that it allows no one else to come before the court, no lawyers with an adversarial viewpoint, only the Department of Justice, only the people wanting that information are allowed to even present a case, and no one else is allowed access to what is happening behind those doors. Section 216 of the Patriot Act extends pen trap orders to include email and web browsing. A pen trap is an electronic device that records numbers called from a telephone line. So they would use a pen trap order to gain access to your phone records. What they did under the Patriot Act was took that, as George Bush said the day he signed it, taking all of that from accessing your phone records to accessing your internet history, including private emails, messages, and accounts. Section 213 is interesting. Under Section 213, they can search your private residences without ever notifying you before or after. You never know when they're visited. So it's a confusing reading, but what was done under the Patriot Act is much clearer. We know now what they used it for. And we know that the government decided through the approval of the FISA court, secret approval, that they could interpret the Patriot Act to say that for national security, they would not just gather in information, email usage, all of that for people relevant to that investigation, but they would gather that nationwide. So what they began to do was take in phone records, particularly internet usage, all of that into massive databases where they took in absolutely everything. Every email, every phone call on every single US citizen was gathered into one central database so that then they could siphon through that and access what they wanted to. Congressman Jim Sensenbrenner is the principal author of the Patriot Act. He wrote this Patriot Act, and he said, quote, "I can say that without qualification, Congress never did intend to allow bulk collections when it passed Section 215, and no fair reading of the text would allow for this program. So the people who wrote the Patriot Act never expected how the government was going to use it." One thing that's worth noting is the Patriot Act in 2001 was not signed into permanent law. It was a temporary program lasting around 4 years. 4 or 5 years. Section 216, the Patriot Act is expiring. Sorry, 2016, I said that too much. 2016, the Patriot Act is expiring, and George Bush has to sign another 4-year extension. So it's something that needs regular extensions. 2006.
2016. It's Bush.
Yes, did I say 16? Sorry. 2006. 2006, George Bush signs a 4-year extension. 2007, he begins Operation Prism. And this is a backdoor into Microsoft, Google, Yahoo, Facebook, YouTube, Skype, AOL, and Apple programs. This program allowed extensive in-depth surveillance on live communications and stored information. Everything down to your Facebook messages can now be accessed through a backdoor. From 2007, these programs themselves, Google, Yahoo, Apple, claimed to have never known existed. This program began with this backdoor first being set up against Microsoft, and they set that backdoor up on September 11 of 2007. They can access your search history, content of emails, chat content of both video and voice, photos, videos, stored data, file transfers, all online social networking, and notifications of your activity. All without probable cause and without a warrant. Companies are legally obliged to comply with requests for users' communications under US law, but the PRISM program allows the intelligence services direct access to company servers. The Washington Post reported that the NSA is tapping into the central servers of 9 leading US internet firms, extracting audio and video chats, photographs, emails, documents, and connection logs. Disclosure of the PRISM program occurred when a top-secret court order compelling telecom provider Verizon to turn over the telephone records of millions of US customers. That secret court order was leaked to the Guardian newspaper. What I'm suggesting is what the Patriot Act violated was the constitutional rights under the Fourth Amendment for the privacy of your private information. That the Patriot Act at 9/11 directly relates to information in this internet age. All that occurred between 2001 and 2014 was made possible by how the powers that be in the US government and the intelligence agencies were able to interpret the Patriot Act. Sandra Day O'Connor, visiting the Ground Zero, where the World Trade Centers once stood shortly after the attack in 2011, said, "We're likely to experience more restrictions on personal freedom than has ever been the case in this country's history." I would suggest that she is correct. The next date I want to mark on our information timeline is 2004. We don't know exactly how far President George Bush wanted to take the Patriot Act. What we do know was that in 2004 he tried to extend it so far that his own intelligence agencies told him this is unconstitutional. And this set up a fight between George Bush and members of his intelligence services. He was trying to pass secret legislation that allowed spying on the electronic activities of US citizens without the need for any warrant whatsoever, above and beyond what we've already discussed, involving the close monitoring of email and internet usage. In this case, he was opposed and blocked by the FBI itself, and this set off a war between the heads of the FBI and George Bush. To pass this new legislation into law, Bush needed the approval of the US Attorney General, John Ashcroft. John Ashcroft, at this point in time, had had a health breakdown. He was seriously ill in hospital, and he'd made another man acting Attorney General in his place. George Bush could still pass this legislation with John Ashcroft's signature, so what he did was he sent the White House Chief of Staff and White House counsel to John Ashcroft's hospital bed to pressure him into signing this new legislation into law. John Ashcroft's widow, not being very happy at having her husband called upon in the state he was in and the pressure being put on him, called that acting Attorney General, who was acting in his stead, to come and counteract the Chief of Staff. This acting Attorney General was a familiar name to us now. It was James Comey. James Comey got in a car and sped around to the hospital bed, and what you essentially had was the Chief of Staff and James Comey fighting over the hospital bed of John Ashcroft as to whether or not John Ashcroft should be pressured into signing this bill. Ashcroft followed Comey's lead and refused to sign the order, as did Comey himself. So Bush decided to push the program ahead, to do it anyway without any approval of the Justice Department, which is not technically permitted. James Comey then confronted George Bush and personally handed him his written resignation. He wouldn't stand for it. This caused such shockwaves. This caused huge shockwaves across the Intelligence Department. Another man joined James Comey and also handed in his resignation. That man was Robert Mueller. Between the two of them, Bush was forced to back down and amend his program. So what we have in 2014 is two men restrain the executive branch in the Patriot Act. 2004, sorry. James Comey and Robert Mueller restrained the Patriot Act and President George Bush. Not suggesting they're good men, not suggesting they haven't done some huge mistakes, but it's worth noting the role they played in 2004, that they acted as a restraint. In 2015, James Comey came out and defended the Patriot Act when Obama was trying to have it abolished. So he certainly approved of the Patriot Act, but not the further extensions that George Bush was trying to place in 2004. Where I next want to take our line is in 2014. So we've covered 1989 or 1969, you've got a 10-year period, 1979, 10-year period, to 1989, then 1990, 1991. So with the invention of the ARPANET, the setting up of a secret court to access information, the invention of the World Wide Web, information management, a proposal, invention of web browsers, the release of the World Wide Web. Then we have the beginning of Russian cyber attacks over the internet, Moonlight Maze. Then we have the Patriot Act, using all that has been done previously. Now the government steps in and starts using that information against US citizens. 2004, we see a restraint placed on that Patriot Act. I would suggest that in 2014, we need to see something about the Patriot Act, something that relates to information. 2014 is a difficult year, as you're probably aware. It is marked as our Sunday law. We know that for the priests, it is our Sunday law waymark. And the argument is about whether or not there is a Sunday law in 2014. And the reason why it is debated is because so far we have not been able to see one. It hasn't been visible to this movement. I want to suggest that there is a Sunday law in 2014. And the key to seeing what that Sunday law was is understanding the relationship between the internal and the external. That whatever is happening internally can be reflected externally. We can already see that on our reform lines, this relationship between internal and external. And I would like to suggest that the internal of 2012, 13 and 14 is the key to understanding the external of 2014 as it relates to information and as it relates to a Sunday law. That's my proposal if you're willing to work with me through this. It must follow our theme. So 2014, I would like to first consider the internal. Inside this movement, that year had some peculiar characteristics, and I would like to suggest those are the key. We had a message come of time in 2012 that predicted what 2014 would be. That message was hindered on two fronts. What problems in this movement hindered that message? So 2012 is hindered by the work of 2012. It's hindered first by the rejection of leadership. Secondly, 2013, the work of enemies. We see enemies coming up inside the movement, Path of the Just, etc. I would suggest that these are the key to understanding the external placing of a Sunday law. What we see over this history, 2012, 2013, 2014, is that the Patriot Act is coming up for a renewal, and Obama ran on the promise that he would repeal the Patriot Act, that it would be discarded. He comes into office and he is, on one level, forced into it by the leaders of his intelligence agencies who say that this is necessary, and he also buys into their argument that the Patriot Act must remain. But he still wants it wound back to some extent. But coming up to this history, in 2013, what we had was the work of enemies. The reason we know all of this, much of this history, particularly about what was done under the Patriot Act in this history, is thanks to one man, and that one man is Snowden, who hacked into and released all this information in 2013. Working internally, he hacked and then disseminated all the information on what the government was doing in secret under the Patriot Act. So you have the work of enemies. I haven't printed it off for you, but I would be, if you wanted it, I can email it or print it tomorrow. There is one interesting site that has listed every Snowden leak and what he showed with that leaked material. This was the greatest attack on the Patriot Act since it was first put in place at 9/11, is 2013 and the work of Snowden. This created a huge change in how companies now store your information. This is the next quote on your second page of your document, just below the indentation. It says, one of the most visible effects of the Snowden revelations was the small yellow bubble that began popping up on the messaging service WhatsApp in April 2016. Messages to this chat and calls are now secured with end-to-end encryption. Developers at major technology companies, outraged by Snowden's disclosures, started pushing back. Some, and they're giving the example of the WhatsApp Messenger service, which was bought by Facebook, implemented their own encryption. Others, such as Yahoo's Alex Stamos, quit rather than support further eavesdropping. Stamos is now the head of security at Facebook. Before Snowden, such encryption was for the targeted and the paranoid. They didn't see the need. This is quoting Gillian York, the Director for International Freedom of Expression at the digital rights group, the Electronic Frontier Foundation. If I can take myself back to 2013. Without Snowden, said York, I don't think Signal would have got the funding. I don't think the Facebook would have had Alex Stamos because he would have been at Yahoo. These little things led to big things. It's not like all these companies were caring about privacy. They were pushed to care about privacy. And this brought in encryption across all those sites that the government had previously been accessing. It has been said, and this was said by this wasn't America, this was in England, and he was the head of one of their intelligence security services. Its name slips my memory. And he came out against Snowden very strongly because what he said Snowden had done was taken so much information about what the government was doing in secret and only released 1%. So the government had to live in fear that everything else that hadn't been publicly disseminated was still in the hands of Snowden, was about to be. So not only did they have to go through and reform their practices with what we could see, but they also had to anticipate further trouble and change behaviour that we aren't even aware of. That was what made him upset. There's a couple more quotes down the bottom of that page. I want to read the second last paragraph. And just to pick up one thought, the almost Orwellian technology that enables the government to store and analyse the phone metadata of every telephone user in the United States, Leon writes, is unlike anything that could have been conceived in 1979 when the Supreme Court case of Smith versus Maryland first allowed the government to collect such data. So what 1979 also marks is not just the FISA court, but also this case that was Smith versus Maryland. And what he argued was for the US government to access his phone records was unconstitutional. And he lost that case, and what that marked was pretty much the beginning of the government collecting similar data on hundreds of millions of people. They now had the precedent to do that. You can trace also that collection of metadata back to 1979. So what I'm suggesting is that the Patriot Act, by the way, we are not under the Patriot Act today. Obama successfully repealed that in 2015. The Patriot Act does not exist today. That ended 2015. What happened is 2013, you had Snowden. 2014, because of the outrage over what he had released, you have this war inside the US government in 2014 about whether or not it should be repealed entirely or amended. Jim Sensenbrenner, the principal author of the Patriot Act, I will quote him a statement that he made in June 2014. He said, "A large, intrusive government, however benevolent it claims to be, is not immune from the simple truth that centralized power threatens liberty. Our government's legitimacy rests on its accountability to the people, and Americans are increasingly weary that Washington is invading the privacy rights guaranteed to us by the Fourth Amendment." So what he's saying is the Patriot Act is unconstitutional, and that is what the principal author of that act is arguing in 2014. And this war is going down in 2014 between these two opposing factions. So rejection of leadership, you have Obama kind of working against the Patriot Act, and largely all of this is because of Snowden's leaks in 2013. In January of 2014, Obama called on Congress to reform elements of the electronic surveillance programs. What they brought in eventually, what was meant to come into being in 2014 was the USA Freedom Act, which is pretty much an amended Patriot Act, putting in much more, elements of privacy. So they wanted a reasonable compromise between security and privacy. They would no longer allow bulk collections and those types of things. So they tried and get this passed in 2014, and it fails in Congress, fails in the Senate. It failed at the end of 2014 by 2 votes in the Senate. So the USA Freedom Act had to then be debated again, and this was largely Democrat-Republican. In 2014, the Democrats lost their majority in the Senate, and by the time the Freedom Act is to continue to be brought back in 2015, it was amended to where it's virtually another Patriot Act. So 2015, Patriot Act ends, USA Freedom Act begins. I want to mark in this history as a little bit of a disclaimer that I am not pro-Obama, not pro-Democrat, not pro-Hillary. My background is none of those things. My background was Julian Assange and WikiLeaks, if I was to mark a personal bias. So I don't mean to go into this history with a personal bias, but Obama is not the bad guy in this history. He did manage to repeal some aspects of the Patriot Act. What he did not do is extend our line of information. I would suggest that he isn't who we are to look for a Sunday law. That this Sunday law does not come through a Democrat government. It does not come through Obama in this history. This is the fight in 2014. What they're trying to do is not bring in a new Sunday law. This is a desperate attempt to maintain what they brought in at 9/11. And the largest defender of the Patriot Act who was determined to have it continued in 2014 in its current state was Mitch McConnell. All they wanted to keep was what they already had. There is no room to bring in a new Sunday law in 2014 if it's going to come from the US government. So a Democrat president, a majority in the Senate, and Edward Snowden, the work of enemies, make this Sunday law impossible, I would suggest. So to clarify, the Patriot Act ceased to exist in 2014, has never come back. We are not subject to it today, but to the USA Freedom Act. That act was a compromise between those who were for and against the Patriot Act. It restricted some aspects of the Patriot Act, but if you read into it, it allows much of the same behaviour. It's ambiguous enough to mean that the Patriot Act pretty much exists almost as it did in 2001. May 7 of 2015, a federal appeals court ruled that this NSA program of collecting bulk phone records is illegal, and you had these cases start to come up where the appeals court started going back and saying that all was done under that history was illegal. So in 2014 we have this work of enemies and also of Obama. So if we're going to look for a Sunday law in this history, I would suggest we look internally. We had a message in 2012 come out of England and enter the United States. And I would suggest that the Sunday law came out of England. Did a work in 2014. Just going back to Moonlight Maze quickly. There's a British researcher and professor named Thomas Rid, and he researched Moonlight Maze, and I find this quote of his interesting. He says, "The future began with Moonlight Maze, 1996. Espionage now looks more like Moonlight Maze than anything that we saw during the Cold War. It really was the beginning of the new era, and it's never really stopped." So if we were to mark 2 years for Russian hacking, 1996, 2014, but it hasn't stopped since 2014. In 2014 also, while we're speaking of this hacking, this is where it began, 1996. It resurfaces in 2014. Over a 24-hour period, top US cyber defenders engaged in a pitched battle with Russian hackers who had breached the unclassified State Department computer system and displayed an unprecedented level of aggression that experts warn is likely to be turned against the private sector. So what you had was a pitched battle between the NSA and Russian hackers. The Russians set up malware in the US systems. They were constantly counterattacked, and this occurred over a 24-hour period with both hackers and the NSA responders just taking shifts to fight out this battle. It even got to the stage where the NSA had hacked into video feeds that the hackers had set up, so they're actually watching the hackers in action in the base that they're working from. They call it thrust and parry moves inside computer networks, and a new level of interaction between a cyber attacker and a defender. The State Department ended up shutting down its unclassified email system for a weekend, claiming maintenance purposes. That was a cover story. What they were trying to do was, without tipping off the Russians, kick them out of their servers. The NSA won that battle, managed to get them out, but the various hacking groups that they were finding inside the various servers, Cozy Bear, APT29, the Dukes, most of the names having some type of bear symbology, the same ones that they find hacking again in 2016, and they're all Russian. I just want to note that we mark 1996 and 2014. And that work in 2014 they describe as really just a test, because all the Russians were trying to do was to hack into the unclassified systems. and that's not such a big deal. They wanted to gauge the response. So if we want to understand 2014, and I know it's a little bit ambiguous, so let's go back to 1989. I would suggest that's always where we step back to. In 1989, Nigel Oakes, a British fellow, establishes the Behavioural Dynamics Working Group at University College London. Nigel Oakes comes from a background in television production and technology. 1989, he sets up Behavioural Dynamics Working Group. Behavioural Dynamics Working Group. And what this was a group formed to study the dynamics of behaviour. In 1990, he founds the Behavioural Dynamics Institute. So 1989, 1990, 91, 1990, Behavioural Dynamics Institute. The Behavioural Dynamics Institute is the leading international centre of excellence for research and development into persuasion and social influence. It is the only academic organisation in the world whose understanding of the psychology of persuasion has been successfully applied on a global scale. That is how they describe themselves. So what he first does is in 1989 he sets up this working group to analyse how information can change behaviour. Then what he does in 1990 is set up this institution to put what that research party comes up with into practice. 1992, Nigel Oakes makes an interesting statement to a trade magazine, Marketing. He said, and I want to write this on the inside of our eyelids, "We use the same techniques as Aristotle and Hitler. We appeal to people on an emotional level to get them to agree on a functional level." This is what he's developing with BDI from 1989, 1990, 1991 forward. We use the same techniques as Aristotle and Hitler. You appeal on an emotional level to change them on a functional level. In 1993, he sets up Strategic Communications Laboratories. 1993 is SCL. Strategic Communications Laboratories. What they do is largely clandestine, but we got a little bit of a view of what they do in 2005 when they set up a booth in an exhibit at the Defence and Security Equipment International in the United Kingdom. What they started doing in this history from 1990 forwards is using psychological operations and soft power in different war zones. They were picked up by the Pentagon, the UK Ministry of Defence. So what they're developing in this history is psychological warfare. They worked out of Afghanistan, these different war zones. So in 2005 they set up an exhibit at Defence and Security Equipment International. And I want to describe that exhibit. What they had was computer screens showing some type of apocalyptic scenario. In one of the cases, they show this scenario, like how they would interact with the government in an apocalyptic scenario. What they're showing on their screens. Over the past 24 hours, 7 people have checked into hospital. This is the story they're spinning, with telltale symptoms of rashes, vomiting, high temperature and cramps. The classic signs of smallpox. Once thought wiped out, the disease is back and threatening a pandemic of epic proportions. The government faces a dilemma. It needs people to stay home, but if the news breaks, mass panic might ensue as people flee the city carrying the virus with them. A shadowy media firm themselves step in to help orchestrate a sophisticated campaign of mass deception. Rather than alert the public to the smallpox threat, the company sets up a high-tech ops centre to convince the public that an accident at a chemical plant threatens London. So what they do is they offer themselves to step in on behalf of the government, take over every avenue of media and information to the public to spin a fake story. So what they'll convince the people is that a toxic cloud is coming on London and the only safety is stay home, close your doors, close your windows and wait it out. This scenario may sound like a rejected plot twist from a film, but SCL was putting this into practice. They described their work as influence operations. It then goes on to describe how they'd set up this exhibit with play actors looking at boards where there are hotspots, North Korea, Congo, different places. So the end result in their scenario is while Londoners fret over fictitious toxins, the government works to contain the smallpox outbreak. The final result, according to their calculations, thousands of people die, but not the 10 million that they'd projected. For them, a success. Of course, the idea of diluting an entire city is a little bit like propaganda. This argument was brought to Mark Broughton, the Public Affairs Director of SCL, and he says, if your definition of propaganda is framing communications to do something that's going to save lives, that's fine. That's not a word I would use for that. So what he's saying is what we do is a good thing. Therefore, you can't call it propaganda. His argument is that we save lives. He says, is it not worth giving an untruth for 48 hours to save X million people's lives? Sometimes the means to an end has to be recognised. Who buys this stuff? Broughton declined to mention many specific clients, noting what he said, that the involvement of SCL, particularly in countries with a free and open media, could make its campaigns less effective. So in other words, if you want to do this, free and open media are not your friend. He said it sounds altruistic, it sounds selfless. There is some of that to it, but we also want to earn money. What SCL then continued to do in the shadows was work through developing countries, work through South America, work through Africa, different countries in Asia under dictatorships. And their actions were not selfless with the governments they toppled and what they worked with in manipulating public opinion, but primarily where they found their market was in developing countries that did not have a free and open media. In 2012, SCL faces a change. What they did was enter the US market. SCL enters the US market. And we're out of time, but what they do in 2012 is they meet two men. First man I want to name is Christopher Wiley. He later leaked much of this information to the press of what we didn't already know, but what was happening between 2012 and 2014, beginning of last year, he leaked to the press. 2012, they meet Christopher Wiley and he becomes their director of operations. Young man, little bit alternative looking, but a computer genius, self-taught. 2012, they meet another man, and that man is Steve Bannon, and he sees something in SCL that he can use, and he takes that to America, to the Mercer family, billionaire family who funded both him personally and the publications he would write, and Donald Trump. They take it to 2012. Robert Mercer likes the idea and he invests tens of millions of dollars into SCL to create the company Cambridge Analytica. We'll close now for time, but we want to look at what this company did between 2012 in its development, what it particularly did in those first few months of 2014, and what we will see is that while maybe not from the government, it's essentially using all the tools that were accessed under the Patriot Act, all those tools for accessing information, and in the psychological warfare that they designed under war zones in Afghanistan and Iraq, they then turn on a civilian population. In 2014, before Trump ever runs for president, they start testing phrases on the American people via social media to see what gets a response. Words like deep state, words like drain the swamp, words like build a wall. All of these were developed in 2014. Donald Trump never came up with anything. These were given to him by Cambridge Analytica. And they were tested on social media platforms. We'll close in prayer, if you don't mind kneeling. Dear Father in heaven, thank you, Lord, for your directions. Thank you that history is rich with detail, Lord, that we can understand what's happening in the world around us. I pray, Lord, that in heart and mind you will prepare us for this information war. Lord, that we will be prepared by understanding the past, that we will understand the future, that in understanding our past history, we won't get to Raphia and misunderstand, that we won't get to Panium and misunderstand. Lord, I pray for those of our family and friends, Father, who aren't in this message or who aren't along in this message, that you will strengthen them and bless them, and that we will be whatever encouragement and support we can to aid them through these coming times as well. I pray this in Jesus' name. Amen.